Welcome to part 13 of the Lackawanna Cutoff, where we'll be talking about passenger trains over the cutoff. Hi, I'm Chuck Walsh and I'm president of the North Jersey Rail Commuter Association. And we're here with Mr. Sam Sloan at Hoboken Terminal in Hoboken, New Jersey. And you're probably wondering, what are we doing at Hoboken, New Jersey at the terminal? Well, going westbound, every train that went over the cutoff would have started here. Trains not only that would have stopped at Blairstown, or maybe bypassed Blairstown for that matter, but would have stopped at places like Scranton, Binghamton, Elmira, all the way as far as Corning, Buffalo, and with transfers to places as far off as, well, Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, and Kansas City. And you're probably wondering, okay, well, maybe we should also think about going to the opposite end, Buffalo, which is 396 miles away from here, where the Buffalo terminal of the Lackawanna was located. Aside from the fact that it's 400 miles away, also have to keep in mind that there's really not too much left there. But on the other hand, this is a very active terminal. New Jersey Transit. There's also a light rail line that's here, of course, bus connections as well. Now we're going to do, and well, I should talk about Mr. Sam Sloan since he's here. Mr. Sloan was the predecessor to President Truesdale. 1899, Sam Sloan retires, and William Truesdale takes over and will be president of the Lackawanna until 1925. Now the Lackawanna before Truesdale is quite a bit different from the Lackawanna after Truesdale. Basically, Sloan oversaw a railroad that was profitable but very conservative. In fact, they never ran passenger trains on Sundays while Sloan was president, although they would run milk trains, to which he, when he was asked why they did that, he said, well, the cows don't observe the Sabbath. So, in any case, what we're going to do here is we're going to take a look inside the terminal, which has been restored. It was built in 1907, as a matter of fact, but it was restored recently by New Jersey Transit. We'll also go to Track 8, which is where we have a photograph of the Phoebe Snow leaving from, many years ago, by the way. And then we're actually going to take a train and show you a few sites along the way on a trip to Dover, because that was one stop. We'll show you the stops at which the Phoebe Snow stopped at. And then we're going to also hit the cutoff. Of course, you have to assume we're going to hit the cutoff at some point. We will. We'll talk about what's some of the things about passenger trains on the cutoff as well, specifically, but we're also talking about passenger trains in general on the Lackawanna. So anyway, next stop is the waiting room. Here we are inside the waiting room of Hoboken Terminal, just outside of Track 8, which is where the Phoebe Snow left. Don't know if it left all the time from Track 8, but we have photos to show you that document that it definitely did in 1950 leave from Track 8. Then we're going to take a look. Actually, we'll go out there and show you what it looks like up front. It doesn't look like it did back in 1950. That's one thing I can assure you. Then we're also going to take a gander off to one of the far tracks, because the train sometimes left from there, and we'll see if we can possibly get any kind of view of what is left of where the old freight yard was located. And then, as we promised, we're going to hop a train and go west. Here we are at Track 8, where we have a photograph from 1950 that shows, don't know his last name, but his first name was Max, and he's standing here with a watch, and he's looking very intently down at his watch, and people are moving past him very quickly, getting on the Phoebe Snow. You can see the observation car from here, Track 8. Track 8 has changed quite a bit. There used to be a sign here. I mean, there's still a sign, but it's in 1950 there was a sign that said a whole bunch of different stops, but the first stop is mentioned as Blairstown. Now the thing is, the train didn't run non-stop from here at Hoboken Terminal to Blairstown. So you figure, well, why was this Blairstown mentioned there? Well, the reason being is that you weren't allowed to get off the train until Blairstown. In other words, if you boarded on, let's say here at Hoboken, or the next stop at Newark, or the next one after that, which would have been Brick Church or Summit or Dover, you couldn't get off until Blairstown. You weren't permitted to do. I don't know if they physically could stop you if, let's say, you bought a ticket to Blairstown but got off at Dover. Don't know, but you were, at least it would say in the timetable that you were not permitted to get off until, well, you couldn't get off unless you got off at Blairstown. Or, of course, west of there. But that was the first stop that you get off at. Now, in terms of the Phoebe Snow ran for only really 17 years, and there's actually a bit of a sabbatical after the Erie Lackawanna merger where the Phoebe is kind of put into mothballs. So it's really not you can say a full 17 years that the train was actually in operation. We're talking about the Phoebe Snow as an example, and that would be probably the train that got the most attention, at least in the diesel era. And Track 8 is very convenient, so it might be that they might have used Track 8 for the long distance trains just because people would be waiting in the waiting room and then they'd just be able to step right out. It's very convenient. But there were more trains than just that left from here. And if we go back into the day, we're talking about even before the cutoff, there was the Lackawanna Limited, and which we'll talk about when we get to Port Morris. There was actually a train called the Buffalo Mail, which was an overnight train. It left here 2 o'clock in the morning. So that was definitely a sleeper type of train. But many other trains that were long distance left from here over the years. In the diesel era, which some of the folks that may be watching this video may remember, trains like the Twilight, which actually left what it would have been like a twilight, like in the 4 to 5 o'clock range, going over the cutoff, like in the 5:30, 6 o'clock range, somewhere in there. I remember myself as a young kid used to see the Westerner go west from here. Not from here, but from South Orange, but South Orange is on the Morristown line, and that the Phoebe Snow not only, but the Westerner also passed by my house. The Westerner really should have been called the Twilight because especially this time of year, we're talking about now, and we're recording in July, that train was coming through South Orange around 8 o'clock at night. Now, my next door neighbor, who was an old Lackawanna man, he worked as a conductor for many, many, many years. He used to call that train the Nickel Plate. And the reason why he called it the Nickel Plate, and I didn't realize that for many years myself until I realized that it made a connection to the Nickel Plate. It was number 7, and it became number 7 on the Nickel Plate, which the Nickel Plate was the commonly used term for the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, which ran west from Buffalo. And so you'd actually have cars on the Westerner train, We're talking now up and through the 1960s, because I don't go back any further than that in my memory, certainly. But the cars for the nickel plate would actually be on that train. So it looks quite a bit different than, let's say, like the Phoebe Snow, where you had the classic maroon and gray color scheme for not only the locomotives but the cars themselves. And then there was the owl, which was basically, you can say, was kind of keeping almost the same schedule as the Buffalo Mail. It was an overnight train and left here late, I think like around midnight or so. As a young kid, I would never seen that train, but that would have also gone west from here. Interestingly enough, the same trains didn't necessarily come back with the same names. The Phoebe Snow did, the Lackawanna Limited did, but there were other trains that didn't have counterparts, like the Pocono Express. The Westerner didn't have a counterpart. They didn't call it an Easterner train. It was just the way it was. And one other thing we'll point out as we go along from here is that based on our last episode, we were talking about freights over the cutoff, freight trains over the cutoff, that unlike freight traffic or freight patterns, the passenger part of the Erie Lackawanna, which we talked about the Erie Lackawanna extensively in our last episode, that wasn't really affected by the change at all in Patterson, with the Garrett Mountain alignment or realignment that occurred. But ultimately, though, it would affect the cutoff, as we talked about. But passenger trains basically left from here. In the early days, they might have gone up the Boonton line. So, of course, now the Boonton line is now gone, or what the original Boonton line through Patterson is now gone. But long before that occurred, before the realignment of Garrett Mountain, the Lackawanna switched everything basically along the Morristown line, which is where we're going to travel in this video. We'll show you selected places along the line. We're not going to give you the whole treatment because it's an hour-and-a-half ride. So in any case, we're just going to move the far south part of the terminal and take a look at what is there, because some of the trains, I want to say some like the Lake Cities and such, which sometimes were quite long, would have left from there for the extended platform length that they had over there, and some of the specials would have left from there as well. I'm thinking like the 614 trips that were run in the 90s, as a matter of fact, from here. So next stop, the other side of Hoboken Terminal. Here we are at the far end of Hoboken Terminal, the southern end. The last track is track 17. As I mentioned, that's where some of the excursions ran, and maybe the longer trains, since the track is, I believe, the longest in the terminal. Behind me, the Freedom Tower, downtown Manhattan. I believe that's a ventilation shaft for the Holland Tunnel, which is not really very far from here. What you see behind me right here is the remnants of part of the Jersey City yard for the Lackawanna. Although we're in Hoboken right here, going not too far, you actually are in the city of Jersey City. And all of that behind us there would be Jersey City. But this would have been where freight cars would be exchanged for, it would have gone to Boston, you name it, probably could have gone even overseas, or receiving shipments from overseas, and they would have been received on the docks here, which would extend it out with rail cars. We can show you a photo of that. And those trains would have been loaded up, or even cars coming in by lighters. What they basically what they do is they don't do much of this anymore, but where they would put freight cars onto a boat, or something that a tugboat would pull back and forth, and then the cars would be offloaded either somewhere else, the Long Island Railroad, or here on this side. And those trains would go out via the tunnels here, the Bergen tunnels, and out via West End and out the Boonton line. We're talking back many years ago now. Well, even after the Garrett Mountain change, but primarily before that. So, in any case, one other thing to point out, the light rail line is over here. The Hoboken light rail line. And on this side, I don't know if you can possibly see it. I'm going to throw a curve to my photographer. You can maybe see the clock tower. That's been restored. That was dismantled many years ago. I want to say somewhere in the 40s, and then it was restored in the last 15 years, I guess it would be. I'm guessing. I'm afraid I don't know the exact time, but I actually have a friend whose father was involved with doing the engineering on that particular tower. So that's it for Hoboken. Our next stop is going to be, and we're going to have to do a change there at Newark. So I'm not sure how much photography we'll get in Newark, but that would have been, if we're going to, in a sense, replay a trip on the Phoebe Snow, at least as far as Dover, Newark would be our next stop. Here we are at Newark Broad Street. We've just gotten off our shuttle train from Hoboken, and here comes our train, which will be taking us west. Coming in from Newark Penn Station. I'm not sure if that's the brick church that we just passed by. After Newark, this was the first stop of the Phoebe Snow. And we've stopped. So they would have probably stopped on track number 1. We're on track number 3. But other than that, this is the same spot. Next stop, Summit. Okay, we're coming into Summit. Railway Valley used to come in right at that spot. There was a small yard for multiple unit cars. And since New Jersey Transit has taken over, they've actually installed high-level platforms here. This was a major stop for the Lackawanna, and the Phoebe Snow stopped here. It's still a major commuting stop for New Jersey Transit, as a matter of fact. A lot of trains used to originate at Summit. They don't do that typically much anymore, if at all. There was also a yard at South Orange, which has long been discontinued. That was discontinued in 1966, when a lot of things got cut back. And this is Summit, and the far side is the track for the Gladstone branch. Here we are at Dover, which is the last stop for our train. Phoebe Snow would have stopped here. Our train is actually moving back into the yard. Now the Phoebe Snow's next stop west of here, this train is moving east into the yard. The next stop west of here would be Blairstown. So, however, our next stop on this video is going to be Port Morris, because we're going to talk about the first train over the cutoff that we're aware of, and we'll talk about that and maybe one or two other things on top of that. So here goes, and we're finally going to see a pantograph. That, my friends, is a pantograph, the thingy that touches the catenary up on top of the locomotive. Next stop, Port Morris. Here we are at Port Morris, where on the morning of December 24th, 1911, the first regularly scheduled train traveled westbound over the cutoff. According to timetables from that time, the first train would have been number 15, the Buffalo Mail, which left, or would have left, Hoboken Terminal, where we were before, at 2 a.m. that morning, and would have passed through here at roughly 3:35 a.m. that morning. And that was a Sunday, by the way, where they did the changeover from the old timetable to the new timetable, and the new timetable included the New Jersey cutoff, Port Morris to Slateford Junction. Now, since our next stop is going to be at Greendale, we're going to talk about the three stations specifically on the cutoff in regards to long-distance passenger travel or long-distance passenger trains. I have to remember that west of here, in terms of on the cutoff, was not part of the commuter district per se. That's going to be a change as the New Jersey Transit's service is implemented. This track here, by the way, is just leads right at this point in time only leads into the Port Morris Yard. That one on the left is basically the old road, or the line to Hackettstown now, or the line to Washington, would have been the Phillipsburg branch. It's been called many different things over the years. Washington Secondary, Conrail called it that. But the difference between that over there and that over here is that historically that was commuter. It did have some long distance pre-cutoff, pre-1911, but the cutoff historically was only served by long distance passenger trains. In other words, trains that had limited number of stops and were not just serving the Eastern District like what is now New Jersey Transit, where we made several of the stops along the way, like Summit and Brickchurch, Newark, and so forth, Dover. So, in a sense, hearkening back to our last episode where we talk about freight, the cutoff, when it is abandoned as a freight-only operation, there was no commuter operation on that. That is not to say that there were not commuters on the cutoff. That's a different issue. There were people who we know commuted from Blairstown. We know from the interview with Jerry Cruz that there were people who commuted from Johnsonburg. Probably not Greendale. We'll get into Greendale because that as a station in general, from a commuter or a passenger perspective, really went out quite early. So that to the degree that there was any kind of commuting, it's probably pretty much lost to history. But as we talk about passenger service in the aggregate, remember that the cutoff just reflected, this is a place where the trains went back and forth. And when we talk about what was happening at Hoboken, well, those trains that left Hoboken were going to come through here, at least as far as long as the cutoff was in operation. And trains coming east from Scranton and west of there, Binghamton and so forth, same thing. For the most part, everything passed through. The cutoff was a conduit, if you will, that was used by the railroad. And one of the things we started to talk about in the previous episode had to do with the influence of the New York Central. Now, the New York Central Railroad, which still runs, it's not called the New York Central anymore, but it ran from Grand Central Station to, well, from the perspective of the Lackawanna to Buffalo, it went much further than Buffalo, much further west than Buffalo, but let's just talk about that section. When we're talking about Buffalo as in the Lackawanna, when we're at the Hoboken Terminal, the New York Central's route was almost 40 miles longer than that of the Lackawanna's between New York and Buffalo. So how is that significant? Well, it was significant enough that the New York Central actually had at one time as many as 3 directors of their own, which sat on the Lackawanna's board of managers. And why would the New York Central want to have 3 people on the Lackawanna board of managers? Well, it's pretty clear that they were there to make sure that Lackawanna didn't run trains faster than they were to Buffalo. And you say, well, that's kind of silly. I mean, would people really, would that really make a difference? Well, apparently it did. It made a big difference to the New York Central. And in fact, those particular directors made sure that there were things that were done that prevented the Lackawanna from competing between New York and Buffalo. Because a person could have taken a train from Hoboken to Buffalo and then got on a different railroad at Buffalo. They didn't have to get on the New York Central, so they could in a sense could bypass the New York Central between those 2 points, and that would have been lost revenue. How did the Central do that? Well, when the cutoff was put into operation, that took off as much as maybe 20-25 minutes from the average passenger train. When the cutoff was built in Pennsylvania, probably, let's say, maybe an equal amount of time. For different reasons, that route that the Pennsylvania cutoff replaced, although it wasn't much shorter than the original route, with Tunkhannock Mountain and all that, that saved, let's say, another 20-25 minutes. And then there are other improvements, so you could talk about maybe, over a period of time, an hour or more with various improvements to the line and improvements in other operational practices as well. But the New York Central made sure that the Lackawanna would never compete. And what they did was, for example, one thing that they did was to insert an engine change at Scranton, for example, for no reason at all, which would waste 20 minutes. Even when the Lackawanna ran trains that really took advantage of the railroad. For example, they had a train called the Merchants Express, and for a short period of time, a year or so perhaps, in 1935, the Lackawanna changes the Merchants Express to be called the Rocket. And the Rocket was really the fastest train that had ever been run on the Lackawanna. It still didn't compete with the New York Central. It was still about 40 minutes longer than the time that it took let's say, the 20th Century Limited or something like that. I don't know if the 20th Century Limited existed in 1935 or not, but any of their crack trains that the New York Central was actually running at that time. But by the way, the Rocket didn't last very long because probably, as the name implies, it goes very fast and then goes someplace and explodes. So that probably wasn't a good selling point for the Lackawanna. So they did change the name back to the Merchants Express and they slowed the train down. But the thing is that there were other examples like that. Phoebe Snow, for example, as well, was basically ran about 8 hours between Hoboken and Buffalo, for example, when it ran in that direction. After the merger with the Erie Lackawanna, it actually started moving toward, or actually ran to Chicago, as a matter of fact. But these are just a couple of examples where the Lackawanna, in a sense, had done all this work and was improving their railroad. Talk about Truesdale, we talk about Sam Sloan, who was very conservative. But Truesdale, who really was an innovator, a builder, and such, and the two cutoffs, the one in Pennsylvania and one in New Jersey, are prime examples of that. They were thwarted from really using that to their best advantage, even though that there were times where they could use it to their advantage, but it was never really allowed to be highlighted. And I think that was certainly must have been something that would have frustrated Truesdale to no end, but his hands were tied. And that's the way things worked in those days. They were interlocking directorships that made sure that certain railroads didn't outperform the other ones. They could do certain things and it wouldn't be a problem, but other things like running your train too fast, quote unquote too fast, between Hoboken and Buffalo would have been one of those, for the Lackawanna. So that's just one example. So in any case, that's a little bit broader overview, but yeah, the morning of the 24th of December 1911, Christmas Eve, the first train came through here. No fanfare, we don't think, at that hour, most likely. There were opening ceremonies opening in the sense that there was a special press run that was run earlier in that month, the 15th of December of 1911. But we're going to move on to the three stations, Greendale, Johnsonburg, and Blairstown. We'll find out that although at the beginning they were treated the same, we'll find at the end that they were not. Here we are at Greendale. This would have been the first stop westbound over the cutoff for a long distance passenger train. When the cutoff opened, the Lackawanna didn't quite know what to expect in terms of ridership for the three stations. So when you look at the first timetable from December 24th, 1911, you see that there are equal number of trains stopping at each of the three stations. Now, as time goes on, that would change. The first changes started within the first couple years, and actually we're just going to show you a graph of basically the whole time period for which there was passenger service over the cutoff and how the fortunes of each station went over time. Greendale was the most unfortunate, if you want to put it that way. By 1940, there are no trains that are stopping here. And even before then, the trains would be only stopping on flag. In other words, with basically a semaphore on the station would be put down to signify for a train to stop because there was a passenger waiting. But very few trains even were designated as a flag stop or having Greendale as a flag stop. Because early on, if you look at the first timetable, they looked at each of the three towns, and Greendale, they mentioned that there were a total of 90 people. I'm not really sure what they were counting in terms of the surrounding area where they drew the artificial line. It wasn't even Greendale in those days, it was Greensville that it was called. It became Greendale in 1915 or so. But get to Johnsonburg, it's not a whole lot different, but we'll leave the discussion for Johnsonburg at Johnsonburg. But as far as Greendale is concerned, we've talked about it in terms of its freight, and there was still quite a bit of activity that was related to that. But in terms of passenger service, the amount of passenger service here, which was modest to begin with and non-existent after, as I mentioned, 1940, basically, that it was reflective of the amount of passengers who used the station. That was certainly almost 30 years. There's certainly sufficient time for the potential for each station along the cutoff to emerge, and for Greendale, it never emerged. It never really showed much promise, and as a result, they, for all intents and purposes, phased it out. The freight operation continued, but the passenger part was phased out because there just wasn't enough patronage to justify it. So, in any case, our next stop will be just a few miles west, Johnsonburg. Here we are at Johnsonburg, the creamery and ice house, and then the station building would have been back there. Armstrong Cut. Rail service ended here. Passenger rail service ended around 1950. It went longer than Greendale, but certainly didn't continue on as did Blairstown's rail service. So, and as we heard from Jerry Cruz in his interview in the Johnsonburg segment, his mom took the train here. It would have been a tough schedule because there weren't that many trains that were stopping here at Johnsonburg during the late 40s. He was talking about the late 40s. Where you could actually, I'll say, hold down the job where you were going in and then coming back via train. You'd have to be very disciplined to make sure you didn't miss that train. So in any case, that's it for Johnsonburg. Our next and last stop will be at Blairstown, which was the main stop on the cutoff in terms of passenger service. Here we are at Blairstown Station. This was the main station on the cutoff for passenger service. The station actually didn't open, the station building didn't actually open at the same time as the cutoff. It didn't open until 1912 and lasted through the first week of January of 1970, at the time when the Erie Lackawanna discontinued the last of the long distance passenger trains. In that particular case, the Lake Cities train, which that was it basically for passenger service. Now, the thing about Blairstown that emerged over time was that there was more of a passenger base. Not huge by any stretch of the imagination, but it was sufficient to justify the continuation of the service all the way past the Lackawanna time. And in fact, in the late 50s, the last president of the Lackawanna, Perry Shoemaker, was actually looking at the discontinuation of passenger service on a couple of stations, Blairstown, Pocono Summit amongst them, and they decided to keep it going. They felt that by discontinuing those stops, even though that would allow them to speed up the schedule a little bit, in other words, the train doesn't have to stop, so you can take a couple of minutes off of the aggregate time that it takes to get from point A to point B, that President Shoemaker decided to leave Blairstown alone. So it survived into the Erie Lackawanna years, and then it survived all the way to the end of when the Erie Lackawanna discontinued what was left of passenger service, because the Phoebe Snow, which we talk about, would have stopped here in both directions up until November 27th of 1966. That was the last of that, for the Phoebe Snow. As I mentioned, 1966 was a year where a lot of things got discontinued by the Erie Lackawanna. Cutting back to Netcong, for example, Sussex Branch, weekend service on the Boonton Line, and so forth. But also the Phoebe Snow at the end, almost the end of 1966. And then there are just a couple of trains that were left after that, one of them being the Lake Cities that still continue to run. And then 1970, that was it. After that, That is it, except for a few specials that were run. Some of them were run under steam, and by, well, we know the story of 1976, what happens then. The Conrail takes over, and then the line after that is slowly, not necessarily, initially it was actually upgraded by Conrail, ironically, and then Conrail pulls the plug at the end of 1978, and then that's where things stop in terms of any kind of rail activity, be it passenger, even specials, or freight. Which is going to actually lead us into our next episode, because now we've gone through freight, we've gone through passenger, and we've looked at them both. We can't say completely, because there's no way to do that within a relatively short, even an hour's worth of video, to adequately treat that kind of a subject with the amount of detail that it really needs. In any case, though, I'm sort of giving a little bit of a glimpse of what where we go from here. Where we go from here is that what happens after Conrail discontinues service. And that's where I'm going to leave it at this point, because that's where we pick up in our next episode. So our next episode will be part 14. So I hope you've enjoyed part 13, passenger trains over the cutoff. I hope you look forward to part 14 on the Lackawanna cutoff.